All right, and apparently it is now live, so I will go post that it's live. All right, let's see. Right now we have 0 viewers, so while we wait, I figure we should go over a little bit of introduction of probiotic / biointensive standards. If you're unfamiliar with what this means, it's basically just utilizing compost or organic heavy soil that can be either no-till or recyclable, and focusing mostly on the amount of microbiological life, fungi, etc. that's in your soil. These will help control, make micro communities that will help control the rhizosphere and plant exudates, things that they exude. So it's a pretty important and revolutionary system when it comes to growing. It means that your runoff isn't going to be quite so bad. It means, even to the point that if you have a high enough amount of certain species like Rhodopseudomonas palustris or others, that you actually could have beneficial runoff, stuff that's beginning to help with the nitrate phosphate problem that occurs from other growers. And this is a huge deal when it comes to growing cannabis, because this is one of the primary ways that they can demonize us as growers, to continually put forth the idea that not only are we utilizing huge amounts of soil, but the watersheds downstream from our grows, be it industrial or home, are occurring heavier amounts of nitrates or phosphates. And it's definitely a problem if people are not willing to look at solutions like these, but the solutions are there and they're quite simple. They'll actually make your growing style a lot easier, because now you don't have to focus on stuff like pH or any of those types of, kind of rather boring stuff more than anything. Now, real quick, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can't go to, let's see, copy and bring some links over for people who are interested. Whoops. Okay. Apparently. Oh, I only have one thing opened. Okay, yeah. I'm trying to post something to the Probiotic Farmers Alliance on Facebook, but apparently not exactly using the right links. So my bad on that to everyone. So there we go. Now, hopefully people will join if they have any questions. I can do this again in the future, because it would be a lot easier to have a subject to talk about if people were asking questions. I'm not to have anything prepared, so I just wanted to play around with a new webcam that a friend had given me he wasn't using anymore, and I figured there's really no better time than the present to play around with it, get to know it, etc. But on the topic of probiotic growing, as for things you can do to get started in it, first up, I'd recommend that you check out buildasoil.com and check out the product Grokashi. Specifically, it's GRO-KASHI, Grokashi. It's on the Build a Soil website, as well as having its own website. These are going to be really your jumping off points. They're going to provide you with most of the information necessary, and then with Build a Soil, most of the resources necessary for you to have a conversion garden, and then begin heading down that path. Important things for you to begin to look into is EM1, which is effective microorganisms. One almost said effective monoculture, because a little bit of a different background, but with effective microorganisms, you are taking stuff like lactobacillus or other forms of lactic bacteria, and in some cases PNSB. If you're looking at like the original blend, they used to have Streptomyces, which is a form of yeast, and then they used to have purple non-sulfur bacteria. At this point, if you're making EM1, generally it's the same thing as just lactobacillus culture, or like in general lactic bacteria cultures, and you are just making a rice wash or a carbohydrate wash to foster a high amount of microorganisms, and then feeding them lactic acid so that those ones outcompete the rest. And then as the pH drops, it begins to condense all of these like strands of milk fat and all that, and you get a thick whey, and sift it or get it out of there, and then go ahead and activate your residual and all that. But which is just activating it with molasses sugar. If you're looking up for a way to do that, just search how to make my own EM1. You'll find a website, Hawaii Healing Tree. It's incredibly useful. I do have links to all these things as well on my own website, which is moderncannabis.com. So if you check that out and then go to the probiotic introduction article, it has links to pretty much everything, from how to go, how to make your own activated compost tea, to making your own lactobacillus culture, to where to find all of the additional information. If you're like me and you like high amounts of direct science, you want to actually know why it's working, I do have links to a lot of different peer-reviewed journals on the subject. If you're looking up further information on really like this style of growing, you can look up a lot of stuff just by searching bokashi, which is the generic term for what grow kashi is. Grow kashi just is made by Allen, and it's made very, very, very high quality. It's got lactobacillus culture, plum syrup, I want to say, azomite, and a form of grain bran, which I think is just wheat bran. So great stuff, incredibly, incredibly useful. It will help form a semi-mycelial mat on the top of your soil, which is really consisting of pseudohyphae, and these will act like straws down to your rhizome, and if you're like me, put a little bit inside your soil as well. So it's an advanced composting layer. It'll hold the moisture at a greater rate, so you'll reduce the amount of water usage, which is really useful if you're in a place like California. Sorry, I hear them a little bit wheezy, so real quick. Yes, I have asthma really bad, so yeah, that does happen to me from time to time. Sorry for slouching as well. As you can tell, I'm not very used to making videos, so I don't have great posture or etiquette in that sense. But on the subject of trying to do things yourself, a lot of organic growers have come from that background of, hey, I like the way I'm doing it now because I can use just inputs from what's around me. It's really simple. It's really cheap. This fits that even to a higher degree. Most of the people who end up going probiotic or biointensive, whatever you want to call it, in the long term, you're generally looking at either recycling your soil or going completely no-till, which no-till is what I'd recommend. It is incredibly easy. No-till just means that when you're done, if you're like me, you don't quite let it dry up because you don't want to lose all of your communities of microorganisms, but you let it dry a little bit and then pull up part of the root stock, but then I'll usually throw that in a grokashi bucket because you'll have like a high lignin source compost at the end, which is great for mushroom and different types of stuff that the fungi will continue to eat and all that. So if you're into that, do that. And then at the end, you'll have like little bits of roots that are still inside the soil. These will act as basically aeration and increased fungal food sources because, like I said before, they're high in lignin. And then you just top dress, put your seeds in or put your next plant in, whatever you're doing. You don't have to change out the soil. You don't have to do anything crazy. You don't have to break your back with a shovel trying to do all the recycling. That's pretty super useful, super nice if you're like me and you have a bad back. So in the long run, if you do head that way, it's going to make your life easier. It's going to make growing cheaper. It's all around a lot simpler process. Seems we have one viewer and oh, nope, they're gone. Okay, fair enough. Cool, no biggie. Well, if anyone does want to come in and ask some questions, that's completely cool. If not, then I'll just finish covering the introduction to probiotics and log off and take a look at how bad this is. So right now, if you're coming into probiotics, like I was saying, go ahead and check out buildasoil.com, check out grokashi. These are very not only essential for going down that standard, but making your own life easier, making growing easier. Seems that we have a new viewer. If they have any questions or answers, there is a question and answer section. I don't really know how it works because I've never used it before. I've never done any of this. So that's all to be seen. If anything is super unclear, then just let me know over on Facebook and I'll check that every once in a while, like right now, and I don't see any messages. But back on to what we were discussing. If you like to make stuff yourself, you can do the whole make your own earthworm castings, keep up on your compost, check out grokashi buckets. They're an advanced composting method that will utilize anaerobic strains of bacteria, which is great if you're trying to get through high lignin sources or, you know, in general, just breaking down stuff much quicker. If you're a grower, we all know that there's a pretty considerable amount of leftover stalks, stems, etc. These are huge for your compost. If you're trying to foster good fungi sources inside your soil, you can be putting these in a Grokashi bucket and making a high lignin source soil very, very simple, or excuse me, a very high lignin source compost very simply. And this is same for like bones from what you're eating, you know, any of those things that you wouldn't normally want to throw in your outside compost pile. Anaerobic bacteria strains will happily deal with it, happily leave you with, you know, excess fatty acids and uh, actually surprisingly a pretty good amount of zoolic acid and a few of the others that are quite useful for the plants, especially if you're a cannabis grower. You're trying to start the fatty acid biosynthesis pathways within cannabis as early as possible so that you can get the most cannabinoid content, or, you know, the most terpene content as possible. And this all starts with the biosynthesis terpene pathways. And generally, if you're interested in looking that up, I would definitely recommend on my website. I have the difference that probiotics makes in cannabis, and it goes over a lot of that, and it kind of gives you an idea of what exactly it is I'm talking about. But if you're unfamiliar, all the biosynthesis of cannabinoids inside the cannabis plant happens from fatty acid structures that eventually end up in your, like, you know, THC acids, or so, you know, THCA, CBDA, CBGA, which the reason why we cure, of course, is to get rid of that acid carboxyl group, which as we cure, we lose it as oxygen and CO2. It's if you're not familiar with the carboxyl group, it's -COOH. And it's pretty amazing. If you look into the biosynthesis pathways, it actually teaches you a lot about genetics as well. Sorry, this is a quick aside. But from the point of view of land races and stuff like that, sometimes we've heard about THCV, which is tetrahydrocannabinovarin. This occurs most commonly in southeastern land races, and I'm taking this from a text by one of the large pharmaceutical suppliers for cannabis. I think it's a United Pharmaceuticals. That's what it is, United Pharmaceuticals. They did a huge paper where they were going over everything that they had found with cannabis so far. They were doing all the genetic testing. They were talking about how, you know, what position the locus and alleles were at for specific traits, how that influences the cultivar. And what they found was, if you're looking for THCV, which is really useful for like diabetes, repairing damaged bone growth and stuff like that, then it only occurred in 5% of the feral hemp population. And when it did, instead of producing like the normal fatty acid structure, it was instead producing diveronellic acid. And for it to do that, it had this shared allelic trait where either it produces THC or it produces THCV. And I really found that quite fascinating. It really shows you a lot about how we had the divergence of species and really how we bred towards THC dominance, because otherwise we would have, you know, at least a certain degree, a higher propensity of seeing THCV in commonly kept elites, which we don't really find as much anymore. I can't really speak as much for older school heirlooms because I haven't really seen as much of those going through headspace gas chromatography or any other form of chromatography. So it could very well be that there are some older heirloom that's not true for, that I'm unaware of. But either way, when you're going back to these fatty acid biosynthesis pathways, you're wanting the earliest stimulation possible. And we achieve this with probiotics. Going back to something I said even earlier, by making the lactobacillus cultures. When we make these at home, we have high amounts of ruminant milk fats. And this, as a byproduct of what we're doing with them and the fatty acids that are naturally contained in them, is going to cause earlier stimulation of fatty acid biosynthesis. Sorry about that. And this means more cannabinoids, more trichome development, more terpene development. So if you've had probiotic weed and you've grown a strain that you've grown for a long time, or your friend's growing it, and you put the two side by side and you didn't know which was which, but you smoked them and one was very obviously stronger, it's almost always going to be that probiotic one. I won't say always, because, you know, law of averages, there might be one or two times when it ends up the other one. But for every time I've ever tried, every strain that I've grown out so far, it has come completely favorably in a biointensive environment where you're utilizing stuff like EM1 and Grokashi and top dressing and ACTs and especially sprouted seed teas, which is something I haven't mentioned yet. So again, if you're coming into probiotics, you might see the acronym SST. This stands for sprouted seed tea. Now, this is incredibly simple. We're just buying either corn, or if we're buying corn, we're going for cytokinin. Yeah, if we're going for barley, we're just generally going for the higher fatty acid groups, and if we're going for alfalfa, we want it for the tricannatol content. So either way, with sprouted seed teas, you're doing something very simple. You're taking a jar, you're putting something over it to keep other things from getting in, and you're wetting it down. Now, usually the procedure is you'll wet it down for a little bit, let it soak. You'll get these plant inhibitors and growth regulators off the seeds. You'll flush that down your sink and then give it a little bit more water. They'll sprout out. Usually you'll have it where you get used to how much dry seeds is put in, and then at which point it has soaked in that much water. You basically know from that point on it's sprouted. It's beginning to use those fatty acids and hormones to cause actually elongation of the roots at that point. So you don't want to let them get too long. You want to utilize those fatty acids and hormones for your plants themselves. So once they even just start to sprout, you're going to grind it with a lot of water and feed it straight to your plants. If you've ever used products like nitrozyme and hygrozyme, etc., you are buying that for a lot of money. And if you want certainty, just read the bottles. They will show you every single one of the bottles says that they've been heat sterilized, so there's no bacteria or anything like that in them. When they say that they are just enzymes, they are very seriously, generally speaking, just barley SSTs that have been pasteurized, and you're already having some denaturing of the fatty acid groups from that process. So it's a bit unfortunate that people don't know this more commonly. Hydro shops make a lot of money because of it, which is unfortunate as well. But if you're trying to do it yourself, just get yourself some sprouting barley. I do use buildasoil.com for that. They have great rates on bulk, and sprout out. I do a little bit higher than what the instruction rate says. I would say like usually a cup this size I would put into 5 gallons completely filled with seeds. When they start to sprout, they'll fill over what you're doing. So make sure if you have it in like a cup this size, you're only putting that much, because otherwise when they sprout, you're going to get seeds literally everywhere, which I've done many, many, many times. But you put that much in 5 gallons, give it to your plants. You can actually do this even with pretty young plants. I've done it with sprouts. At occasion seedlings, but if you're doing that, I would recommend diluting it out about 1/3 of what I just showed you. And if you're using alfalfa, always use it at half the rate, because tricannatol is an incredibly strong growth hormone, and it will cause some really, really, really funky growth patterns if you're not careful. If you use too much, you will know really fast, because your plants will get kind of, they can't support themselves really well. They get kind of really, really long and lanky, and it's just a pain in the ass. No one really wants that, so try to avoid excess tricannatol content. And actually, speaking of alfalfa, I'd like to cover one more thing that I notice a lot of organic growers do that I think is kind of unnecessary, and that's using high amounts of alfalfa or any really nitrogen-heavy fertilizer source directly into their soil. Now, when I say that, I will admit I use neem. That's my main nitrogen source when I make my modern mix. This is a very slow release, so I've never really had any encounters where it's burned a plant or anything like that. Because I avoid using alfalfa or kelp or any of those types of things, I can ensure that it takes maybe 7 to 10 days for my soil to be ready total, if I'm mixing it up for a new place or otherwise. A lot of people will say, well, does that give it sufficient time to cook? Well, cooking is really just a method of compost. You are making sure that either the nitrogen's in the proper form for the plant and it's not going to burn it, or your organic matter has settled, or you've began to fix the carbon to nitrogen ratio. If you set up your soil right from the beginning, that's really not necessary. If you have more nitrogen needs, you can top dress them, you can give them an ACT. A lot of people I've seen have become bigger on the whole premise of, well, I just want to water for my whole flower. And that is totally doable. If you set up really good soil, you can totally do that. The only thing I would say is that, having tried side-by-side differences, I still do feel that using SSTs, aloe interfillet powder, coconut water powder, SSTs, etc., you will end up with a heavier end product. And if you're coming from hydro or a production environment where that type of thing is essential, you're not just producing meds for yourself, then you're going to want to do as much as possible to make sure that you're coming up the same mark in your yield as you would with hydro, if not better. And you're also going to end up as a kind of a side effect of going to these new growing standards with a lot more trichome, with a lot more terpene and phenolic structures within the cannabinoids, which means they're going to end up with a lot more presence in body when you're smelling them or smoking them, etc. So, oops, sorry about that. So if you're interested in any of those things and you're just trying to make your growing process as simple as possible, definitely look into probiotics. This has pretty much been the basics as I've covered them. You may have heard me mention coconut water powder and aloe interfolate powder. Again, those are available from buildasoil.com. Make your order there. He's in Montrose. If you're in Colorado, this is super convenient. He actually has a physical location now, and so definitely check it out if you're near there. If anyone has any questions or otherwise, I'm going to give them kind of a chance to ask them, but otherwise I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up here shortly because I don't have a ton more to say. But quick review, buildasoil.com, grow kashi, GRO-KASHI. That's your grain silage that has been inoculated with effective monoculture 1, lactobacillus culture, which we talked about earlier, basically the same thing anymore. They use the same recipe that we would now call just lab culturing. Back in the day, it used to have streptomyces and purple non-sulfur bacteria, but now, generally speaking, we have to buy the purple non-sulfur bacteria separately. So try to inoculate as many microbial sources as you can. If you live near a forest, actually a really cool thing to look into is the beneficial indigenous microorganism culture, which the website I discussed with you before, Hawaii Healing Tree, I believe has. If not, check out Gil Long, I think it's something like that. It's the unconventional gardener. I might have said his name wrong. Sorry if I butchered it. But check him out. He has probably the all-around best recipes I've seen for anything from fermented plant extract, grow kashi, and like I said before, the indigenous microorganism culturing. So check out all those sources. Make sure that you form your soil to have a good amount of organic content, that you continually use compost. If you are already doing compost, check into the bokashi composting. Like I said, it's much faster. It does allow you to utilize anaerobic strains. And if you are coming from a general organic growing background and the idea of anaerobic strains of bacteria kind of scares you a little bit, look into grow kashi. Again, like I've said many times, the anaerobic tea that you can make from this is very, very simple, and it's very, very powerful. And you will notice very quickly how it helps with your rhizome defense and seeing elongation of roots and rootlets. You're going to see most likely like a much finer type of root, and you're going to get more of them. And this is going to end up with higher capillary action, higher osmotic principle. So it's a pretty wonderful thing. I am the person behind Modern Microbes, so I will mention that really quick and briefly. If you haven't used it before and you have any questions, you can always shoot me any messages on that. But basically, it's a microbial nitrogen fixers, your mycos, your some solubilizing bacteria, which are incredibly powerful. They act as biofertilizer levels, so they will allow you to use less overall fertilizers, or if you want to stick with your current program, you're going to see more out of them. That's a principle I like to talk about under the name accelerated homeostasis, because what is generally happening inside your rhizome, we are basically utilizing so that we can accelerate the few variables within that can be boosted up without ruining that whole homeostasis. So it's a very important thing, and I think that as we continue down the road of biointensive / probiotic growing, it's something that's going to become more and more of a mainstay, because we have such a limited supply of what we make our, even alfalfa and stuff like that. When we divert that for growing with, albeit that is a very small amount that's diverted from crops that would normally go to animals and stuff like that, it is still a section, and the less that we're utilizing overall, the cheaper it is, and the more that more people can grow for an affordable rate. So if you've been throwing away your soil, or you've come from that type of background, this is essential. We do not create soil at the rate that we use it right now in the world. So it's more important than ever to really understand and fully grasp the idea of making healthy soil that can be recycled, that you can do no-till with and just pull out your plants, top dress it, throw something else back in. like we talked about earlier. And this is all pretty much going to be as I see it, the movement we head towards more and more. Instead of just talking about organics, but you'll start to hear people actually talking about, do you recycle your soil? Do you use biointensive standards? Because if you just simply don't use chemicals, but you don't have a whole lot of life in your soil, you're always going to wonder why it's not showing up next to hydro or what you're used to. This is because there is no life to keep that homeostasis. There's nothing there to be doing the work that you would be doing otherwise. You'll see with organic growers like myself that I don't pH. And this is because you can basically rely on these micro communities to use what they exude and what they take up to control the flow of hydrogen. And pH is pondus hydrogeni, which is the distribution or amount of hydrogen inside of a solution. So that's really all you're ever worried about when you're talking about pH being too high or too low, is either there's too much hydrogen ions or they're being taken away. So you see bacteria that have stuff like molecular hydrogen pumps, and they're considered acidophiles because they can handle crazy amounts of hydrogen. Once you kind of get that concept, it's a little bit easier to understand. It's easier to understand why we don't have to pH, why we can utilize something that's already giving off acids that might be causing natural chelation and stuff like that, and how that can control the sorry, I totally forgot what I was talking about. I just noticed that we have a question. What about keeping the roots in the soil after harvesting? If you have roots after, they're going to end up as a aeration source, and they're going to act as a high lignin source for your fungi food, for all your fungi parts of the web. So fungi generally, they like to decompose lignin and other structures like that, and that's going to give you tons of useful fatty acids, and it's going to make your microbial community just basically swell up and get huge because they love it. It's like giving them Red Bull. It's never been an issue. I've now been recycling the same soil I gave it to a friend when I left to Washington, so I guess it's been about 4 years now, and it's never been an issue. I let my soil dry out just slightly, not enough that you're going to kill all of your microlife. Give the main stock that's left over a bit of a pull, throw it in a kashi bucket to start decomposing, and then whatever's left over in there is going to act as just natural aeration and a natural lignin source for the fungi to decompose. So great question, and happy to answer it. I think just a second ago we were discussing really I don't know, so I'm just going to go on to the next topic. You heard me mention aloe interphyllate powder and coconut water powder. When we talk about these, I want to cover a few things about them because there's kind of some confusion, I guess. Excuse me, a little bit cotton-mouthed, but the reason we use those is because they contain indole acetic acid-like compounds or other, natural forms of plant growth regulators / plant growth hormones, to be most specific. These are, forms of auxin, gibberellin, cytokinin, indole acetic acid, if I remember correctly, is one of the most common forms of auxin. When we use aloe powder, it's a good source of saponification. So, I don't use yucca as much just because I do have the aloe interphyllate and it works for that source. So there's really no reason to buy more things. And they also act as a source of sugars. Now, sugars is something that in organic growing, we talk about a lot, but we really rarely are able to cover the more fine points of. We hear people say, only use molasses because it's in the form that bacteria might want or the form that fungi like, and it has natural amounts of minerals, and that's very true. I've seen people say just as much, oh yeah, you can use honey or you can use aloe or any of those things. Well, those all are very distinct forms of sugar. We have fructose, glucose, galactose, and which is basically the precursor to lactose. Or I might have the chain wrong, but I'm pretty certain of that. I'm pretty sure it's the precursor to lactose. And there's probably one or two that I'm not thinking of: sucrose, glucose, fructose, and galactose. There we go. And these are all very, very different. They all have incredibly different, not only principles, but the way they form, the way they bond, the way they cause sugar. Everything about them is incredibly different. So if you're using, say, honey, or you're using any of those like natural or plant sugars, you're generally looking at high amounts of fructose. Now this isn't like bad, obviously usually you hear fructose, you think high fructose corn syrup, but they aren't going to be useful for your fungi sources at all. They're not going to be hugely bacteria soluble to the bacteria right off the bat. They are totally useful, but they aren't useful as fast or in as broad a range. We generally look towards glucose if we're doing stuff inside of a lab, or you can get even just plain sucrose powder. The reason that molasses works so well is because it has a very high amount of minerals and calcium and a slight amount of phosphorus just naturally from the plant that it comes from and the process that it's made. If you want a higher amount than that, you can look at stuff like piloncillo. I probably said that wrong again. If so, sorry. Panella, whatever you want to call it. You might even see it called jaggery if you're from Australia. This is basically when they're making molasses and they just try to concentrate the content. So they boil it down, same as you would with most anything that you're concentrating. And as they boil it down, you end up with these really thick, huge chunks. If you've ever been to like a Mexican food market, you've seen these semi-phallically shaped or candle shaped, whatever you want to call it. They're like little pyramids, whatever. They're always a little bit different, and they look kind of like dark brown sugar, one huge mass. This is panela, whatever it is that you call it or whatever it's called in your country or region. This is incredibly useful. It has way, way, way higher amounts of calcium and phosphorus and all the mineral content we were getting before from molasses. However, it's not quite as water soluble. So generally the trick that I do is I will freeze it to make it a little bit easier to get through, and then put it in the food processor, and it will sound like you might break your food processor. I don't know how strong yours is. I have a 2 horsepower one because I have a Ninja all-in-one system where you can stick a different thing on the top and it does food processing as well. And when we get it, it's all food standard, so we have no issues using it in the same one that we eat with or anything like that. I'll make a big ass bag that's all powdered panela, and I like to use it as a top dress. It'll dissolve a little bit slower, but it is going to give you a much higher source of mineral content, much steadier. So you can use molasses as well if you're looking for something that's going to hit more immediately. Then molasses still could be the best option for you. I don't know your watering schedule or really how you do your stuff, but if you see when I make I'll use a lot of the high fungi compost matter from a bokashi bucket and put in a bunch of panela, not a bunch, I guess, about a third cup to around 2 cubic feet of compost, and then go around and add first I'll add some calcium to it, usually glacial rock dust and gypsum. And once I've done that, then I just go around and top dress all my plants and just put, a handful, 2 handfuls, whatever, on top of each one until your topsoil is covered with about that much, if not that much, if you have a little bit of a low soil content, depending on how airy it is when you do your initial watering, and then it settles and all that. I'll do that quite often actually in my grow. I like to reintroduce more organic matter. Very often I think it helps keep things kind of stabilized, keeps calcium flowing. When we're utilizing stuff like EM1, you're making calcium cycling happen at a much higher rate. So it is really important that you stay on top of those natural sources of calcium. And don't try to overdo it. You'll fuck up your calcium to magnesium ratios. Some users do really, really like dolomite lime. For the liming that I do, I just use glacial rock dust and gypsum like I've mentioned before, but dolomite does work very well as well. I don't have any knock to it. Some people say that it doesn't work quite as fast as what most people are looking for it to. That does seem to be the degradation standards, but whether or not that's the case, there has to be some form of solubilizing bacteria or otherwise that's causing, it's still a good amount of liming to happen, because if you're a grower who's done like sips, like Alan, the guy who started Grokashi, has been showing people to do, I know he uses dolomite lime, so it definitely does work. We've seen exceptional herb done that way. So, in general, don't knock things in probiotics until you've tried it. It's surprising the scales, I guess, of flexibility. Just because something might work better doesn't mean that the thing that you did instead of doesn't work. And that's a really important concept. Sorry, one more drink. And again, I think I've pretty much covered everything in the basics of probiotics. Excuse me, except for fermented plant extracts. That's the very last thing that I have to cover. So fermented plant extracts or fermented botanical extracts, you'll see those occasionally written up in the PFA or on any of the websites dedicated to this. It'll generally be FPE. Yeah, FPE. If you see those, you're seeing people use non-citrus fruits because the terpenes that make up citrus are very, very intensely antimicrobial. You might be familiar with seeing like orange wipes and stuff like that. That's why. So stay away from citrus plants. That's incredibly important. But otherwise, if you have stuff that's near rotting, or every once in a while we get some sweet potatoes from the farm just down here, and we'll buy a little bit too much, and we don't make sweet potato custard or pie quite as fast as we meant to, and they get crazy roots out of them, and I don't have a spot to go plant them right now, so got nothing really to do with them. Rather than just composting them, you can turn stuff into fermented plant extracts, and it's going to make a very quick way to utilize that very intense amount of nutrients, phytonutrients, phytohormones, mineral content, etc., that were in those initial plants, which does mean that it is very important that with whatever initial plants you have, that they be organic, that they were grown preferably in remineralized soil, and preferably obviously with generous amounts of microbes. This would mean that they'd have a higher amount of calcium, they'd have a higher amount of minerals, they're going to give you more when you ferment them. These fermented plant extracts can be used a variety of ways. You can apply it to your compost and top dress. You can add a little bit to your water and water it in. There's all sorts of things you can do with it. You might have seen, if you're in the Probiotic Farmers Alliance, again, that's over on Facebook, or if you've checked out my page before, I've talked about back in the day, I think it was right around like 78 to 82, there was a PhD soil microbiologist who he wrote about bug juice, and this idea that he was basically replicating on a larger standard what you would do for culturing bacteria or life, anything like that, and he was just doing it at a way larger scale and utilizing it in a very simple way. It's very, very powerful, very good stuff, and it doesn't just attract bugs. I mean, if you're an indoor grower, generally we've kind of gotten this idea that all bugs are bad, and it's very easy to get very scared by them, but it also increases microbial life very intensely, and it's a really wonderful process that if you haven't looked into before, I really highly recommend it. Just look up bug juice soil in Google, you'll find it, or if you want to find a little bit further reading on it, over on my page I did do a write-up on how I've modified it a little bit through practice with it. But even his original recipe is just absolutely wonderful, very, very good stuff, and I highly recommend you look into it. I believe with fermented plant extracts, with what we were just talking about, real quick, back to that, you're just using any of those in a high sugar source and fermenting them. So just wanted to get that out of the way. I think I forgot to mention that it's just, decomposing fruit or fermenting fruit, you really just have to have a high sugar source and make sure you put an airlock on it. Certain herbs we have seen will cause a higher reaction. I think that at the point that you're seeing a reaction that's kind of violent, like mint and stuff like those, you're seeing antimicrobial action. So rather than these continue to set up and produce at a very constant rate, once that antimicrobial part begins to just destroy the cultured bacteria that are in it, it releases a huge amount of gas, and this can be really intense. Make sure you buy decent airlocks. I have seen people's that broke and different various things like that. I've never seen an exploded jar or anything like that I've seen from actual like beer brewing, but I could imagine that if you have high enough action, if you're just kind of playing around with what life is indigenous around you and hasn't been sprayed, then I could see that happening. Now that we've kind of covered all the basic things, I wanted to mention one or two advanced notes for those of you that are just curious. If you want to play around with some stuff in your grow and you're doing probiotic style growing, one of the things that we've been working on around here is going up to, I live near the Grand Mesa and the monument and all that. That's part of the Rocky Mountain chain of mountains. I am not recalling the name of it at the moment. As you can see, I don't get out a ton out there, but we're going up to the mesa and getting a sagebrush that hasn't been sprayed by pesticides or anything like that, and thus have a higher amount of methyl jasmonate. And we're curious if methyl jasmonate will hold up in fermentation. And if so, then you basically have a reliable way to stimulate the jasmonic response of a plant. And this is a pretty amazing thing. When you look at the plant defense system, the natural defense systems that they have, you're looking at generally the salicylic response and the jasmonic response. And these are abbreviated like the SAR response, which is systemic acquired resistance. I think I've actually seen a few places that will call it SAD, which is systemic acquired defense, but the technical name is systemic acquired resistance. If you're trying to find actually more research on it or anything like that, that's the name you need to search. And the other one is just the jasmonic response pathways, which is kind of a newer idea. I think it's 2006 that they did the initial studies with that, where they found that methyl jasmonate increased the trichome on they're called like ice plants, and they grow very, very, very similar trichome to cannabis. And they found that it hugely increased the trichome rate, but it also significantly reduced the amount of overall harvest. It seems like when it's putting all of its energy into those fatty acids, which we talked about earlier with the fatty acid biosynthesis, it really is no longer trying to focus so heavily on growth hormones, on making more cellulose and stuff like that. So you end up with shorter plants. And for some people, that's great. Some people, you're going to want to find your balance. It also is worth noting that some studies have been showing that the more we activate the salicylic pathways, the more resistance there is to the jasmonic pathways being activated. So there's some level of harmony that we kind of have to find in these that we haven't really approached yet. Now, the reason we haven't done that is, a multitude of things. Like I said, this is relatively new research. You can find it on Google Scholar, is where I recommend if you're trying to find research papers. But it's very fascinating because we had previously talked about a lot as growers UVB light, and UVB, it's stimulating higher trichome, higher cannabinoid. This is totally true. It's causing actually that earlier usage and creation of fatty acids for biosynthesis. Now, when we are doing, UVB, you're looking at a spectrum that's, if we're trying to find UVB spectrum that has peak absorption rating, I saw a study that was done in 2011, I want to say, which is one that I've posted a graphic from quite a bit. It's got, the general cannabis chlorophyll A and B absorption range, as well as carotenoid. We find that around 311 is peak for cannabis, and that's really amazing because Philips makes a bulb for revitiligo and a few different skin conditions. At one point, it's even said eczema, where they recommend it as a skin therapy, and they make these narrowband bulbs that are just 311 nanometer UVB with reduced phosphor coating to stop so much of the UVB being blocked. Which, if you're not familiar with how we make general incandescent bulbs, they have a phosphor coating which is electrically excited, which is also keeps in the UVB generation from that excitation process, which is very good because UVB and UVC can be very damaging to our skins. UVC is instantly cancer causing. Specific ranges of UVB also are cancer causing and can cause other effects. I know with the 311 nanometer, they found that that specific band has the least amount of reddening or, sunburn or any of those issues. So if you're doing a warehouse style grow, this would be really important because there's not a lot of forms of UVB that you can stimulate on that sort of scale that your employees are not going to be feeling the consequences, because it's like being under tanning lights all the time. That's going to be an issue eventually. So it's pretty amazing, the technologies that are coming out right now and allowing us to look at the biosynthesis pathways in a bit of a different way. We no longer have to look at, it was kind of the more common rhetoric to say that, oh, if it's super frosty and real dense like that, most likely it was grown synthetics. You used to hear a lot of that. And anymore, that's not true at all. I mean, for a long time, salts had managed to stimulate areas of the plants that we are just now figuring out how to stimulate organically. But as we do so, we are going to surpass what hydro can do. I believe that very firmly, and I believe that we're actually pretty much already at that point. When we begin to look at stuff like utilizing ruminant milk fats for zucolic acid, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. I gotta say real quick, I mostly just read things and I don't have a lot of people to talk about them with. So you may occasionally hear me pronounce something very, very, very wrong. If that happens, please private message me because I need to know. I mean, I don't want to sound like a fool or anything like that. I try my best to look up technical definitions. If you're not familiar, you can use the define colon and then a word in Google, and it will return the definition, uses, etymology, and generally a nice pronunciation guide and all that. There are definitely times where I've been completely misusing a word or mispronouncing it. So if that happens, please just let me know so that I can correct it. I'm always very happy to learn those things. But again, if we're using stuff like ruminant milk fats, like we do with EM1, you're looking at zoolic acid, and this is really important. This is the kind of like the beginnings start off of fatty acid biosynthesis. Usually you're like looking at like hexonic acid, which becomes it forms against acetyl coactive enzyme, and then that turns into zoolic acid, which goes to excuse me, which I think right after zoolic acid is when it becomes the THCA, but I might be missing a step in that biosynthesis process. The full trees for them are available on moderncannabis.com, or you can really just look up cannabis biosynthesis pathways. You will find exactly what I'm talking about. Very interestingly, if you ever are, look up limonene pinene degradation charts in regards to biosynthesis pathways. I think you guys will be it's pretty fascinating. Especially if you're familiar with like isomerization or any of those types of things. It's weird to think that a terpene is just isomerized and it becomes so different. But that's a story for another time. I hope you guys have enjoyed everything that I've talked about today, and if there's anything that I was unclear about or you feel that I got wrong or need to talk about in greater depth, please let me know. I am more than happy to do so. If you have any further questions or anything like that, just send them my way, and I'm sure I'll do this again just because it's kind of fun and I want to play with this webcam a bit more. I'm sure this one was not that great. It's my very first time doing it, so thank you for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.